Well, today is Father's Day, and I'd like to speak with you for a few moments about the qualities of being a godly father. And the text that I will use this morning is found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, and we'll be reading verses 7 through 12. So if you want to open your Bibles to that passage, you can follow along as I read in just a moment. As I said, today is Father's Day, and like Mother's Day, it is a day that we honor and celebrate the role of being a father. Now, on Mother's Day here at our church, we looked at the life of Hannah, the mother of Samuel. Her story is found in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and parts of chapter 2. And we saw that she was a woman of great faith, intense prayer, integrity, and gratitude. And when we got all done, we made note of the fact that the qualities that we saw in Hannah as a godly woman and eventually a godly mother would be equally applicable and valuable to men as godly fathers. Now, it wasn't that we were trying to blur, as it were, the roles between men and women, or motherhood and fatherhood. It is that we recognize the fact that when we seek to be godly men and women first, we are far more likely to fulfill the roles of fatherhood or motherhood as God designed them. Being a godly woman from a biblical perspective, and the Bible has a lot to say about being a godly woman, establishes a woman as a godly mother, someone who God can bless, like Hannah. Well, so it is with being a godly father. In order to be a godly father, one must seek first to be a godly man in either role, father or mother. The quality of being a godly person is the first step leading us to being successful. That truth further supports the biblical principle that having God in our lives, being sensitive to his presence and being willing to submit our will to his and to follow his instructions and his guide through his holy written word makes all the difference in the world about being successful and being effective in whatever role we seek to fulfill as human beings. It makes us a better person. Well, when I looked for a passage then to speak to you this morning, I wanted to find one that would support or be compatible with that principle. One that would identify what it means to be a godly father. And perhaps when we're done, that we could look at those qualities and see that they're equally applicable to women. Now, as we read through this passage this morning, I want you to note that on the surface, Paul is not discussing fatherhood or motherhood. I like that because it forces us to look a little more deeply at the points that Paul is making to his audience in that ancient city of Thessalonica. In chapter 1 of Thessalonians, Paul is reminding his audience how the gospel came to be with them at that in that ancient city. Chapter 2, he speaks about what it means to be an ideal godly servant. He is in effect defending his behavior and that of his ministry partner Timothy as they worked and ministered amongst the Thessalonians. But as we read through our text this morning, you will see that Paul uses an analogy at one point about a mother caring for her young children. And as he comes to the end of that paragraph, he speaks about a father and how he relates to his family in his home. And this allows us to identify qualities of being a godly father. And like Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1, we see qualities that are hopefully interchangeable. That is to say that they would be desirable in either fathers and or mothers, and actually, I would argue, both. Well, I want to make one other small point, and that is that in the Christian community, as we gather to worship, no matter what our denomination is, we tend to refer to ourselves as the family of God, brothers and sisters in the Lord. And so we are in effect acknowledging that our relationships at church are very similar to our relationships in our homes, our human families. Now, with that view in mind, or with that fact in mind, I want to look at our text and see if we can unpack or identify certain qualities that would relate to being a godly father. And then we will see if we can relate them to being a godly mother also. You see that I want to make sure that no one feels left out this morning, and that I'm specifically not preaching just to fathers on Father's Day. Well, look with me at those first two verses in this paragraph, verses 7 and 8 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Let me read that for you. As apostles of Christ, we could have been a burden to you, but we were gentle among you, like a mother caring for her little children. We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you had become so dear to us. Well, we see from those two verses that the first quality that Paul seems to be identifying is that he and Timothy acted in a manner that would be characterized as being gentle and loving as they worked amongst the Thessalonians. And while he is speaking about his behavior and Timothy's also, he's illustrating that behavior by the analogy of a young mother caring for her baby children, her young children. But as we reflect on that, he is also drawing us a word picture of what it means to be a godly man. Because certainly Paul is a man, as was Timothy. Now, we could spend a lot of time developing the concept of what it means to be gentle and loving as men. I'm not too sure that our current culture would use those two words first in describing either men or fatherhood, but they are very biblical qualities. I might remind you to think about Abraham and his relationship with Isaac. And before Isaac was even on the scene, there was his nephew Lot, for whom Abraham had become a surrogate father when Lot's father, Abraham's brother, died prematurely. There were some that would say Abraham was maybe too gentle with Lot. And that would be an erroneous presupposition of his responsibility for Lot's poor choices as an adult. And that would be unfair. Think with me for a moment about King David. He had lots of children. And I think particularly of Absalom, the son that led a revolt against David. David had to flee Jerusalem, give up his throne, and run for his life because Absalom was leading a revolt against him. And yet David sought full reconciliation and restoration with Absalom. And when Absalom met a violent and premature death, David grieved greatly. Well, the Apostle Paul teaches us about love and gentleness within the family home, as he writes in the New Testament, and he admonishes men to love their wives as Jesus loves the church. Now, that's a really high standard, but that's the biblical standard for the conduct of godly men. Now, we know from behavioral science and their studies that one of the greatest things that a father can do is to model before his children the example that he loves his wife, their mother, and he treats her with gentleness and respect. Behavioral scientists will tell us that that is one of the most stabilizing and securing qualities that a child can see in his or her home. Dad loves mom and treats her with respect and gentleness. We certainly understand the devastating consequences when that is not the model that they see. The Apostle Peter makes this same point as he writes to the churches that he founded in Eastern Asia Minor. These folks were some of the first Christians to be persecuted by the Roman Empire to the point of death simply because they were Christians. And Paul, in writing to encourage them, at one point admonishes the husbands, the men, to love and to be gentle with their wives. There's no question that the quality of being loving and gentle is one of the most important, if not the first quality that any godly man should seek to develop. Now, I want to be quick to say that the concept of love is not the love portrayed that by our culture. It's not what we see on television or in movies. It's biblical love. And the concept of biblical love is that it is self-sacrificing. That means that we put the needs of others, in this case, our wife and our children, before our own. They come first, or second, only to our relationship with God. God comes first. Because obviously, if your relationship with God is not secure and in good shape, you're not going to be doing well in any of the other relationships and or roles that you seek to play. Well, the second quality that I find is found in those same two verses. Let me read the second part of that passage one more time. We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but ourselves as well. Paul is using or speaking about what we would use in the 21st century in Western culture. We use the term being transparent. Being transparent simply means that we are being real. Paul was describing that he was real when he worked with the folks in Thessalonica. It is so important for us as godly fathers to demonstrate the fact before our children and our wives that we are real. That is to say that when things go very well in life, that we are secure and open enough to give God the credit for those blessings that have come into our lives. That we say thank you, and that we say to our children that God is the author and the giver of those blessings. Conversely, when we fall on tough times or life becomes, for whatever reason, difficult, whether we've made a mistake and we've messed up at work and we pay the consequences, or even through no fault of our own, just the fact that life becomes difficult, that we remain secure and solid in our relationship with God and we work through resolving the problem. In either case, these are incredibly valuable learning opportunities for our children. And they learn by those opportunities and watching us how they are to behave when life goes well or perhaps not so well. Because that's the reality of life on this plane. How will our children respond when they are older and they meet barriers or stumbling blocks, or they just quite didn't make the cut? Something happened that caused them to have grief and disappointment. Will they remember back that their father always saw God as his rock, his security, his peace? Or will they remember that as a dad, we toughed it out, as it were, on our own? Did we show strength through vulnerability? by acknowledging our dependency on God, or did we try and show strength by our own individualism, being our own man? Well, transparency before our families and before God shows a strength of commitment to God that is to be modeled by our children. Let me put it this way. If God is not trustworthy and we don't rely on him first as fathers, and that we demonstrate that by our own behavior, and that we always want to be in control and we are going to tough it out or be our own man, whatever rationale we offer, how are we going to have any credibility when we come to teaching our children that they should have a relationship with God and that they should trust him when we're just speaking words to them? Because children watch far more what we do than what we say. Now, the third quality I find in this passage is in verse 9. And it is somewhat difficult. Let me read that passage for you and explain what I mean. Paul writes, "Surely you remember, brothers, our toil and hardship. We worked day and night in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preach the gospel to you." The quality that Paul is talking about here, quite frankly, or easily understood, is hard work. And the reason I say that it's dangerous is that I see it as a two-edged sword. On the one hand, certainly we want to teach our children that food, clothing, shelter, vacations, all the recreational amenities of life or entertainment elements of life, they don't grow on trees. They come because mom and dad work really hard and to provide those things for them. Success in life comes from hard work. Well, the flip side of that is we don't want to demonstrate the fact that we are so committed to our work or to anything outside our family and our responsibilities to our family that our children and our wives, our children, our family ends up not having quality time with us. A lot is said about quality time. And the statistics that people who keep those kind of records offer are abysmal at how much time dads spend with their children. And that devastating consequences that seems to have. Now, admittedly, there are times in life where our jobs or some project, something in life, requires an inordinate amount of time and our attention and focus. That's just life. But that is also a good learning experience for children in that they see how we maintain balance in difficult times. Balance is maintained by discipline and focus and making hard choices. But it is a wonderful learning experience for children. You know, the truth is success in life, and particularly in the Christian life, requires hard work. It requires discipline and diligence, because nothing of value happens by accident or default in life. It requires us to be intentional, sometimes strategic, but always diligent and disciplined. Well, the fourth quality that I see in this passage that Paul writes to the Thessalonians is in verse 10. It's the quality of being authentic. Listen as Paul writes, "You are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed." Now, Paul is using some interesting language there. It's like he's making an oath, and he's calling God as a witness. but that demonstrates to us how certain he was of the purity of his motives and his conduct as he and Timothy worked amongst these Thessalonian people. He says first that he was holy. That means he was set apart to God. God and God's purpose for these Thessalonians was Paul's first priority. He didn't have a wife and children at this point in his life. And so he was totally dedicated to his calling by God to work with these folks here. A godly father is focused on being set apart to God by pleasing God, making God first in his life, and by following his word as instructions for the principles and the precepts by which he orders his life and helps order the lives of his family. And that fact leads us to the second adjective that Paul uses, righteousness. Righteousness simply means making right choices. And for Paul, it was making right choices as God directed him in ministering to the folks at Thessalonica. As godly fathers in our time, righteousness means that we make right choices, first as a husband, then as a father, and as a spiritual leader for our family, by following, again, what we learn in God's word, the scriptures. That's where we learn what is right and what is wrong, because God is the author of the ultimate right and wrong. Well, the third adjective is a little intimidating, because he's not only said he was holy, he said he was righteous, but then he said he was blameless. And if we don't look at that word a little more carefully, it sounds like he says he was perfect. He never made a mistake. And that's not what that word means. It means integrity, honesty. He's saying that both he and Timothy acted in a manner that would be described as holy integrity. They were honest, transparent before these Thessalonians. Fathers, human fathers, are seldom perfect. I haven't met one yet. I'm not perfect. I understand that. But we can be focused on God and pleasing him and our responsibility before him to be godly fathers by being transparent and holy and righteous. That is to say that we are following his word and it's setting that model for our children and our family. But we also can be, as Paul says, blameless or honest. What that means to us in the role of fathers is that when we make a mistake, we are men enough to say, I messed up. I made a mistake. In those famous words, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That makes us honest before our children. Well, the last quality I see here is in verses 11 and 12. And here is when Paul speaks about a father caring for his children. That's the analogy he uses for his behavior. Listen as he writes. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God who calls you into his kingdom and to glory. Now, I want you to notice those verbs and the tense of those verbs. They're all three of them in the present tense. And Paul does that intentionally because he wants to emphasize to the Thessalonians that behavior is constant and ongoing. He always acts as an encourager, a comforter, and urging them to live lives worthy of God. Well, as godly fathers, we are to be encouraging. That means we are to build up the self-confidence of our children, that we're sort of like a coach, a motivator. We tell them and we show them with our behavior that we believe in them, that we support them, and that we're there for them. Now, admittedly, our role changes as our children mature. From primary age to teenage to young adult and college, and even when they go away and are grown, you never stop being a dad. And you never stop being an encourager, putting confidence and expressing confidence in your children. I find it curious that Paul goes from talking about encouraging to using the word comforting. But I realize that it speaks to the reality of life, that at whatever stage of life we're at, sometimes, often, we miss the mark. As a little kid, we fall off the bike and we skin our knee. As a teenager, we didn't catch the pass on the 1-yard line on the 4th down, and we didn't win the game. All kinds of things happen in life where we wish we could have done better or it would have turned out differently. But the role of a godly father is there to comfort and to encourage. We'll get them the next time. I'm with you. I'm your best fan. I believe in you. Well, look at that third verb that he uses, because that's the ultimate goal in life. He was urging the Thessalonians, and thus we as godly fathers urge our children, our families, and ourselves to live lives worthy of God, because God calls us into his kingdom and to glory. Now, if Paul was seeking to make a positive influence on the folks there at Thessalonica, how could these three qualities as ongoing behaviors not make a positive influence if we were to model them in our homes as godly fathers? It's an incredible responsibility. And being a father, well, think of this. The biblical perspective of parenting is always a mom and a dad. It's a two-person kind of job because it is a great responsibility. It's a job that requires us to be set apart to God, making right choices because we're willing and seek to follow God's instructions, directions, guidance that we find in his word and through prayer. But the end goal is always that all of us, mom, dad, and children, live lives worthy of God, who is calling us to be part of his family, to be in his kingdom, and to glory. You know, as godly fathers, or just as fathers, we represent God in our families, to our children. We represent God when we go out into the world, either to work or to play or just whatever we're doing. We need to remember that often, always, our behavior demonstrates what it means to be part of the family of God. And often without even having to say a word, because people watch how we live. You know, God gave us the model of Jesus, his son, and how he lived amongst us here on earth. And Paul is living out that example that he saw in Jesus as he ministers to these folks at Thessalonica. We follow the model of Jesus and follow in the footsteps of Paul and Peter and Jude and James and all the others that have gone before us. Well, I'll leave it up to you to make a decision whether you think these qualities are applicable to moms, but I certainly do. I think they're great qualities for dads and moms as servants of the Lord that are raising children, and are they themselves living lives that are worthy of God.